Hey guys, my name's Taylor Ludwig and welcome to another episode of the Poor Man's Workshop. In today's video, I'm going to show you the second half of my assembly / outfeed table. In this video, I'm going to show you how I assembled the drawers and installed the drawers, as well as installed the TTrack. Those are the two main things that I'll be covering in this video. If you haven't seen video 1, make sure you go check it out. It'll make a lot more sense where we're picking up on this build. Thanks a lot for watching and hope you enjoy it.
Before I begin, I went through my build plans again just to make sure everything matched up with the newly made carcass. If you haven't had an opportunity to download the build plans, there is a link in the description below if you're interested. The first thing I did with this part of the build is get the runners installed for the small parts containers. As you can see, my first attempt didn't really go very well. But it's a pretty easy process. All you have to do is make sure the runners are thick enough to support the small parts containers, but not so thick that they don't allow them to slide in. Each runner will hold 2 small parts containers, and I just attach them using brad nails and glue. Spacing the runners out is pretty key to making sure that the small parts containers don't run into each other. All I did was measure the thickness of the small parts containers and then added about 1/2 inch for the top and the bottom to make sure that there was enough clearance for all of it. There will be a total of 10 small parts containers, and these will be for things like brad nails and screws. I also wanted to add kind of some bigger totes to the bottom. So I put one of the small parts containers in and then measured down to make sure that these bigger totes will have plenty of clearance. These totes will be for bigger things like caulking material and really anything that doesn't have a place around the shop. Hey, you can never have enough storage in the shop. After that was complete, I wanted to add the banding or the border around the outside of the top. This is made from 1-inch maple hardwood. And since I had a really fine edge from using the router in the previous video, all I had to do was glue and nail it on with some brad nails. Now there was a little bit of overhang, so I used my flush trim Japanese pole saw to flush up the edges, which made for a really smooth and square edge. After that, it was time to get started on the tedious task of making all the drawers and cabinets for this table. To start, I cut all of the parts to the dimensions in the build plan after checking to make sure that those dimensions are correct on the newly created table. For shop furniture, I don't do really anything crazy with the joinery because it's just shop furniture. So here's the method that I use to create drawers. All I do is attach the sides using glue and a brad nail, creating a box for the drawer. And then I countersink and screw 1-inch screws. I'm using 1/2-inch plywood for these drawers, so the glue and the screws should create plenty of good stability for the drawer. Then I always check for square on the drawers and move on and do all the other ones. Let me know if you like this method or if you would do your drawers a little bit different. Once the boxes were all created, it was time to install the bottom. The bottoms are installed just using glue and a couple brad nails, and then came back later and pre-sunk and drilled 1-inch screws to give the bottom some strength. The bottoms are actually 1/8 of an inch longer than the box, so I go back with my router and a flush trim bit and trim off all of the excess. If you found that this video is helpful, make sure you give it a big thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you as part of the PMW team. Then it was time to get started on the slide out trays. These are made of maple hardwood and 1/4 of an inch plywood on the bottom. I used some band clamps to glue and clamp the maple pieces together. And then once they were dry, I chiseled off any excess glue squeeze out. The bottoms are connected with some glue and brad nails. And then I added a small chamfer to the bottom just to give them a more finished look. Then I moved on to creating the bucket holder. Now this was kind of trial by error. I just measured and traced the bottom part of the bucket and then cut it out using my Forstner bit and jigsaw. Now at first you'll see that I actually got the opening wrong because the bottom is smaller than the top ledge. So I decided then to trace the top and do the same thing again. So if you create a bucket holder, trace the top, don't trace the bottom. And it fits perfectly. Next, I used pocket hole joinery to attach the box sides. In this project, I definitely got my money's worth with my pocket hole jig, that's for sure. These sides add a little bit more of an appealing look to the holder, as well as add more stability and a place for you to add drawer slides. Next, I moved on to making the slide-out cabinet. Now, the slide-out cabinet will hold these big jugs of glue that I have, as well as some of the unused terry towels and paper towel rolls that I have. You could obviously make this cabinet to hold really anything you want it to hold, but those seems to be the things that don't have a place and are always just floating around my shop. I first started by adding a couple ledges to both sides of the bottom panel. This isn't necessary. In fact, you might not want to do this depending on how tall your things are because it'll make it a little bit harder to get stuff in. I actually decided to take this off later, and yes, it was a pain with the screw and the dried glue. So make sure that this is something that you actually want to add. It really just makes it so that the bottles or the terry towels don't fall out the side when you're pulling the cabinet out. Then I attached both of the platforms to the sides using glue and countersunk screws. I used my parallel clamp to just make sure everything was straight and square, and then screwed through the front and the back into each platform. Now the front and the back aren't going to be seen because the front will actually have a fake front on there to make it look a little bit more appealing. So it really doesn't matter if you screw through the front. And then I added the top in the same method. Now you could do all of this with pocket hole joinery, but I chose not to.
I also went out and bought the Rockler Universal Drawer Slide Jig. I'm really excited to actually use this. I've seen a ton of other builders use this, so this isn't a sponsor for Rockler's product, but it's a great product. I haven't used it yet, but right here, we're gonna use it.
To use the jig, it's actually really easy. You just slide the drawer slide in, then you slide up this little black thing that secures it in place into the jig. Then you align it to the front edge of your cabinet and you simply set the screws. The nice thing about this jig is that it sets the drawer slide back to the exact amount it needs to be, as well as makes your drawer slide level using the front edge of your cabinet as a perpendicular reference. It also has a handy bar to make sure that the spacing between all your drawer slides is perfect and exactly what you want it to be. Once they were all installed, I just added a little bit of lubricant to all of the drawer slides and then started to actually install the drawers. Now, this method of installing the drawers into the drawer slide I got from Johnny Brooks at Crafted Workshop, and it worked perfectly. This is the first time I've ever used this method. For the first drawer, you use a 1/2-inch spacer on the bottom to lift it off the ground, and then you place the drawer inside and screw the brackets that are supposed to go on the side of the drawer in while they are inside the drawer slide. Then you use another spacer to lift the second drawer up off of the bottom drawer and screw the brackets in again. And then I repeated the same process all the way up through the entire cabinet. Obviously, making sure you have correct spacing is vital for this method to work, but it worked out perfect. So I did the same thing with the other side. Then I installed the drawer that goes right above my air compressor and the drawer slides for the slide out cabinet. These drawer slides are on the top and the bottom. Next, it was time to install the continuous grain fake drawer fronts. I measured and cut them out to the right size and then added edge banding. I won't go into detail on how to do edge banding. I do have a 1-minute short video out there on how to do edge banding. I'll link it below. Installing the drawer fronts is pretty simple. I just used a spacer to lift it off the ground initially and then clamped it in place and screwed from the back of the drawer into the drawer front using 1 1/4 inch cabinet screws. I then added the next drawer and boosted the drawer front with a 1/4 of an inch spacer, clamped that drawer front in place, and did the same thing, screwed from the back to the front with the cabinet screws. Then I continued the same process until all of the drawer fronts were installed. It's important to keep these drawer fronts aligned so that the grain is all continuous. That's what makes it continuous grain. It just gives it a better look, a more finished cabinetry look. And then using some shop magic, I did it to the other side. Then it was time to get the TTrack all installed, but before I could do that, I needed to do some sanding and finishing up on this top. I also routed a round over just to give it a little bit of a softer edge on the edge of this tabletop. I then laid out my TTrack to kind of figure out the spacing.
So you might be wondering why my TTrack is black. I actually got this TTrack from Amazon, and it is really well made. It's actually kind of like sandblasted, which is really cool. Kind of has that rough look. Much cheaper than doing the blue ones that most people use. And I actually really like the look of the black, the contrast with the way the table is. So I'm going to be using this black TTrack.
To route a groove for the TTrack, I started by marking where I wanted the TTrack to be. Then I put my plunge router with a straight bit there and lined up my straight edge. I used a piece of offcut maple to make sure that there wasn't any tear out going into the table as well as coming out on the other end. Like I mentioned in the previous video, I learned a lot while trying to use this plunge router. Contrary to what I'm doing here, I learned that it's actually easier to push the router than to pull it. I felt like I was a lot less likely of varying from the straight edge. After doing a couple passes and checking the fit, I moved on to the next one. I wanted each TTrack to be about 9 inches apart. That'll give some good space, but also make it so that the TTrack won't be too spaced apart and I'll be able to work on smaller projects. Once the grooves were cut the long way, I cut the grooves going the shorter way of the table. And then I always check the fit just to make sure it all lined up and fit pretty good. Once the grooves were cut, I did a little bit of patchwork and did a little bit of finish sanding with my orbital sander to give it a smooth finish. And I added some water-based polyurethane to the top just to prevent it from getting dinged up and to protect the nice top. Then I can start working on installing the TTrack intersection kits. Now these kits are really awesome. Really, you don't need an intersection kit. You can cut these all by yourself if you want to, but I didn't want to do that. It was worth $8 per intersection kit to not have to cut those. And it's pretty easy. All you do is line them up in the intersection and then pre-drill and screw in some number 6 screws that I got from the local hardware store. The nice thing about TTrack is that most TTrack is made of aluminum, and aluminum is really easy to actually cut with your miter saw. Now, it's a little nerve-wracking cutting metal with the miter saw for the first time, but I promise you, it really is not that big of a deal. You could cut these intersections with your miter saw with just some normal TTrack if you want to go that route as well. After that, I installed the long sections of TTrack off camera, and then there were small little bits of TTrack that I needed to fill in between the intersection. Because each one of these small pieces was only going to have one screw in it, I decided to use some Starbond adhesive to make sure that these didn't move and stayed in place. It's probably a good idea to use adhesive throughout the whole thing if you want to make sure that these T-tracks are permanent and are not going to move when you clamp something heavy down. As long as you route your grooves correctly, all of these pieces should fit and shouldn't have an issue with the T-bolts sliding through and back on them. The ideal scenario is to make sure that your T-track is so smooth you can slide a board across, which is what we got. With the top finished and the T-track installed, man, this table looks smooth. After I installed some anti-slip drawer liner, it was finally time to get everything organized in this table. I started by adding my small parts containers and my smaller bins to the side, as well as added all my glue bottles and my rolls of paper towel to my slide-out cabinet. Here's a good look at all of the things that just float around my shop and don't seem to have a home. So I started filling all of the drawers with these things. I'm not going to go through what's in each one of the drawers, but I do have to say now pretty much everything in my shop finally has a home. The middle trays are used for smaller things like adhesives and chisels that I need to grab in a quick hurry. And then my side cabinet will hold all of my air compressor parts and my air compressor. Boy, am I happy with the way that this thing turned out. This table gives me everything I would ever want in an assembly outfeed table, with the downdraft, the T-track, all of the storage, everything that I need is built right into this table.
Hey guys, thanks for watching, and that finishes up the assembly outfeed table. I'm really happy with the way that this thing turned out. It is awesome and has really made my productivity a lot better in the shop here. So if you want to get plans, they will be on my website. I'll link it in the description below. And I hope you guys had fun with this one. It's been a really fun build. So make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. That way you can be up to date with any projects that come to the Poor Man's Workshop. Thanks again for watching. And like I always say, never stop creating.